Hello, my name is Scott Larson. I am the writer, creator of the comic book series Visitations. Visitations is an independent comic book that is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. It is part ghost story, it's part history book, it's part superhero adventure. And if you would like to read a digital copy of the first issue, please email me at visitationscomicbook@gmail.com, and the link is below. And I'll be happy to send you a digital copy of issue number 1. What I've been doing for the past few months is I've been interviewing different people who are connected with the comic book community. And I'm really excited today because, well, before I tell you who it is, the person who, when comic books were created, they originally were created back in the 20s, and they were reprints of newspaper strips. And over time, somebody came up with the idea of taking the old newspaper strips and turning them into brand new stories and publishing them that way. The first person to do that on an ongoing basis was Major Malcolm Wheeler. And that was in 1935 with New Fun #1. And the thing that's so interesting about that is it's not just the fact that it was the first modern new stories that were printed, but New Fun #1 ended up becoming the precursor of DC Comics, which is still going today. And so who I have here to talk a little bit about that is Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson, who is Major Malcolm Wheeler's granddaughter. And she has a lot of the history of those early days, but she's also done a few things as well. She got DC Comics to publish a modern version of New Fun #1. And so that's all been reprinted, and it came out last year. She's going to talk a little bit about that. And she also did this book here, which is DC Comics Before Superman. So, so Nikki, if you would be willing to jump on here.
Okay.
There you are. Hello. How are you?
The first thing I should mention is that my grandfather's name is actually Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I know it's very long, and I'll explain why. His mother, my great-grandmother, Antoinette, was a suffragette. And back in the day, the suffragettes hyphenated their names with their husband's name. So she was Antoinette Wheeler, and when she married T.J.B. Nicholson, she became Antoinette Wheeler-Nicholson. So that's why we have the hyphenated name.
You know, something really, a story that's not quite, a little bit related to that, but not quite. There was somebody who I knew a number of years ago, and he had 2 last names. And what had happened was he had married somebody, and you know, it's when the way it's worked in the United States is when a female will marry, you know, a man will marry a woman. Sometimes the woman will keep their last name, but then add the last name of the husband onto it. And so his wife had done that. And they had made the arrangement that they would both do that. So he was Terry Nelson Johnson, and he had the hyphenated last name too. So it was a little bit different, but somewhat similar as well.
Yes, yes.
So, so I want to ask you a couple of questions, and then you have a lot of things to talk to us about. But one of the things that I find really intriguing about you, and I'm interested. We're obviously interested in your grandfather, but I'm interested in you as well and how you got involved in all of this. But you're also part of this, like, this line of offspring of original comic book creators. Athena Finger, I think she's the granddaughter of Bill Finger, who co-created Batman, is one person. And Christy Marston, who is the granddaughter of Charles Moulton Marston, because everyone has to have 3 names from back then. He created Wonder Woman. And so there's like this group of people, or this band of people who are gathering together, who are the offspring of the original creators. And so I'm curious, first, I'm curious about your personal history, whether you were a writer or something else, and then what it's been like interacting with people who are doing basically what you're doing. You're getting the publicity about your ancestors out there.
I started out in theater as a writer, director, sometimes actress. And from there, I was in New York for a while, naturally. And then I realized at some point that I was not going to be famous. And I was really sick of the whole New York scene of auditions and that kind of thing. And I just naturally gravitated to publishing. And I've been involved in publishing for 30, 40 years, I guess, as a ghostwriter, editor, writer, publisher. I've had an audio publishing company at one point. So publishing and writing is part of my background. My mother was a writer, publisher, editor. And naturally, from the paternal side, my grandfather. So I think it's in my genes, I guess, in my DNA. And so that's what my background is. The way I got started, the way I got involved in my grandfather's history is that I did not grow up with my grandfather. My mother and my father were divorced when I was very young. And so I never really knew that side of my family. And when I moved up to New York from the South in the early, around 1976, I wanted to reconnect with that side of my family. And when I did, I guess because I was an adult coming into the family at that point, and my aunts and my uncle and my father related to me as an adult rather than as a child. And so they found it very easy. And also because they knew my mother really well, they found it very easy to talk to me about my background as an adult, not as a child. So I got a lot of stories and information from them in them wanting me to be a part of their lives. And the more I knew about my grandfather as a small child, and I knew vaguely that he had something to do with Superman, but I didn't know what it was. And my mother at one point told me that my grandfather sold Superman for a trip to Bermuda. So that's not true. But there's an element of truth in that story, which I discovered later. So I was already fascinated with finding out about my grandfather, and my aunts and my uncle and my dad, because I was so interested, they started giving me photographs and letters, and I ended up becoming the family historian. Nobody else, people were interested, but they never really stuck to the interest the way I did. And because of my background in research, as a publisher, writer, editor, and also because I did a very intense master's degree on the divine feminine in classical Greek mythology and theater, which was pretty intense. And so I have a very solid research background. And I don't know what it was. I think it was not having grown up with my grandfather and seeing, as I learned more about him, seeing that he was forgotten. And I thought that was terrible, because it became very obvious to me how important he is to comics history. And so that's really what I think motivated me is that, and also my my connection to him as a person, as a creative person. In terms of Athena and Christy, there's also Laura Siegel, Jerry Siegel's daughter, and surprisingly, Harry Donenfeld's grandson. I guess we kind of consider ourselves family in a way because we have some similar backgrounds and experiences that other people don't have and don't know. And there's also this tendency in the comics community to dismiss what children or grandchildren of important creators know. They just there's an assumption that the family doesn't know anything, and sometimes that's true, but often what a family member knows is the context of the creator's life. And that is something that people cannot research. They can't research that familial context. So that's very important for comics history.
So, so your book, DC Before Superman, came out in 2018, I want to say, or late 2017?
2018.
2018. Okay, so was that about the time you started? You'd started your research before that, but you've kind of gone all in on not only the family history, but in a public way. Was that around the time you started that, or was it earlier and people just hadn't heard about it?
It was earlier. It's been an uphill battle. I started researching back in 1997, and I didn't really come out to the public until about 2008, when my grandfather was inducted into the Eisner Hall of Fame. And that was really the first time that I got to know people in the comics community. And I started doing panels at comics conventions. Michael Uslan has been a really great mentor, and he's an incredible comics historian himself. Danny Fingeroth is a very dear friend, and he helped me get into comics conventions and start speaking at panels and that kind of thing. And then I love my grandfather's pulps, and a lot of people don't really know what the pulps are. So a lot of people think, the general public, I think, has this idea that pulps or pulp fiction are those 1950s paperbacks with sort of noir stories. Right. But pulps actually began in this country around 1883 with the Argosy. And these were all fiction magazines. And the reason they were called pulps is because of the pulp paper they were printed on. And they were really popular. At one point, there were hundreds of titles of these magazines, hundreds. And my grandfather wrote for the pulps from about 1926. It's the first one of the pulps I've found with it, that he first wrote in. It might have been earlier, but that's the first one I've been able to find, and until about 1956. So he continued to write for the pulps even after the comics. And that's what really interested me initially. I was intimidated by the comics because comics, guys who know their history in comics can be very intimidating because a lot of them have been at this for 50 years and they know all the details. And especially as a woman coming into that particular area of comics, it's intimidating. And so I didn't really jump into that immediately. But I did jump into the pulps because I just love them. I got a couple of pulps off of eBay and I started reading them and I just fell in love with them. They were great stories, really fun adventures. So not the kind of 1950s sort of noir that people think of pulps. My grandfather wrote adventure pulps based on his own adventures, on his own life adventures. And that's how I got into really researching him, is through the pulps. And then when I finally did jump into the comics, I realized right away that something that the guys did not know, that some of the comic stories in his first comics magazine were based on my grandfather's pulp stories. And because I knew the pulp so well, I immediately spotted those stories. And I just thought that that would be a good way to reintroduce him to the public, is through those pulp stories.
So how did you go about doing that?
Well, fortunately, over the years, I've gotten to know a lot of really incredible guys in this area. And one of the guys that I became very good friends with is David Armstrong. And David is just amazing. And he had a really good collection of these pulps. Mm-hmm. And so we started figuring out which ones would work in the book. So basically, David curated the entire artwork and has a lot to do with the way the book turned out. And so that's part of it. And also, I specifically wanted certain stories, comics in the book because of the pulp connection and the interesting part of it. Leo O'Malia, who was an artist, he started out as an illustrator in newspapers, and he started working for my grandfather. I think it was the fourth New Fun. That was his first comic that he started in 1935. And he was with my grandfather throughout the entire time. And I just love his artwork. It's really, really just so uplifting. A lot of his panels could just be standalone artwork. They're so well done and evocative. A lot of time, there's a very famous cover that I quote in DC Comics before Superman, where the cover is a man and a woman. With the man has a gun and they're dropping out of a plane, and you see the plane, and you see the whole story is told without any dialogue. Mm-hmm. That's a really, really talented artist to be able to do that.
And then that's in here, right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. That's.
I'm looking for it.
Yeah, it's in there.
So these stories in this book, and you know, I'm going to go back to some of the other stuff, but the stories in this book, they're from the actual New Fun.
Well, they're from more than New Fun, because some of them go all the way to, more fun, new comics, adventure comics.
Right. So how are you, I'm going to ask you a question about the rights to that, because you're obviously this stuff is still connected with DC Comics. How were you able to publish this stuff?
It, there's some gray areas, shall we say?
That's fine. You can stop right there.
No, I have been very careful to communicate with DC from the very beginning. And I have had a very good relationship with some of the lawyers who are in charge of rights. I've made it my business to do things on the up and up. And so they have generally, for the most part, been very positive and very helpful to me. So.
Okay, yeah, I was curious because I know that you had posted on Facebook a couple of years ago your visit to the archive, to the DC archives.
Right.
And so you were able to go in and see some of the old stuff there as well.
Yeah. Well, Benjamin Leclerc, who is the archivist right now, is absolutely super. He's a historian by background, and he's just incredible. And I'm so glad he's there because he's doing a really terrific job. What happened was that because I started to become more known among the collectors and the people in that particular area of comics, the early comics, I have a group on Facebook that is devoted to the Major, and the guys in there are really phenomenal. Most of them have amazing knowledge of early comics, and I couldn't do anything without them. They keep me from making really big mistakes. And so one of the guys on there alerted me to the fact that on one of the collector sites that my grandfather's very first comic, New Fun #1, was for sale for $12,500. And of course, I do not have $12,500 lying around. But I went on the group and I said, guys, we got to do something because this is important to preserve. My fear was that a collector would buy it and then, it disappeared. Yeah. And so, and I specifically addressed DC Archives saying, you guys need to buy this. Well, there was a lot of back and forth, but I managed to convince them to buy the comic for the archives. And so that was the reason that I was at the archives, was to see if they had gotten the comic and I was able to see it. And then the idea was to reproduce it, do a reprint, and they asked me to participate. And so I wrote a biography of my grandfather, and I also pushed for short biographies of all the creators, which they agreed to. So that got in there as well. And so it was quite a wonderful project. I loved working with Benjamin. He's just super. And the guys who did the artwork at DC were absolutely incredible. It's a stunning book. Everybody who's gotten it has just flipped out because it's so beautiful and just really well done.
So they didn't have a copy of it.
They had a copy, but it wasn't a good copy.
Okay.
And this was a very good copy. And that's why I was anxious for them to get it and preserve it. And then, of course, it's available to comics historians.
Sure. And it being reprinted too makes it available for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're really fun. They're uh, the first new funds, 1 through 6, were tabloid size, so they're oversized. And it was New Comics #1 that came out in November 1935 with a December cover that was the first comic book sized, not exactly, but more towards what we consider a comic book size.
So, real quick, I'm curious of something. Was your grandfather still publishing when Detective Comics #1 was printed?
Oh yeah, yeah. Detective Comics was his idea.
Okay.
He one of the reasons I keep bringing up the pulps is because they have a lot to do with comics. And if you know anything about pulps and you read pulp stories, they lend themselves very well to comics. They're written in such a way so it's very cinematic, easy to follow stories, that kind of thing. And so my grandfather, when he first came up with the idea of original comics, my grandfather was a strategist, and he had studied strategy, and he knew from having been involved in pulp publishing, writing, that kind of thing, that in order to make any money, he was going to need to have not just one comics magazine, but he was going to need at least 4 or 5 titles in order to see any return. And so within the space of a little over, around 4 years, he managed to really start the comic book industry with new fun, more fun, new comics that became adventure comics and detective comics.
And then, so at what point, so he started Detective Comics. At what point did he sell Superman for the trip to Bermuda? Bleh, I said that wrong. That was a joke. At what point did he sell the company?
He didn't sell the company. He
Okay.
was forced out of the company.
Okay. So where in the timeline was that?
March, April 1938.
Okay. So Detective started in 1935?
No, 37.
37. Okay. So he had it for about a year, and it was bi-monthly, I'm assuming?
No, it was monthly.
Was it monthly? Because and I'm curious because and the reason why I'm asking about that, and then we can talk about the other stuff in just a second. DC was going to publish the Detective Before Superman books, and they had actually published an 80th anniversary of Detective Comics, and and they were supposed to have the Slam Bradley story from Detectives #1 in there, and it is not in there. And I've actually they had published back in the 80s a hardcover of the best Golden Age stories ever told, or something like that. It's on my shelf behind me someplace, but that had that first Slam Bradley story from Detective Comics #1 in there, and it's it's fairly racist, and I'm assuming that was why it did not end up in that book, and I'm assuming that that's part of the reason why those early issues of Detective were they stopped publication of them, or the reprints. I mean,
I don't know really the answer to that, but I do know. I know around the answer to that.
okay.
From what I was told. Michael Uslan was working on the introduction, and so he and I went back and forth a lot while he was working on that. And that was around the time that AT&T was in the process of purchasing Warner Brothers and DC. So there, I think that the short answer, yeah, is that the racist material was of concern.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certainly ways to deal with that. And other people, other publishers have published earlier comics and dealt with that. So, I mean, it certainly could have been, it could have been dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
But they chose not to, so.
Yeah, I was curious about that. So talk a little bit about, I want to start with, you had mentioned that your grandfather came out with a number of different titles. And so, and so since you know now, because you've been studying his history for a while, talk about how that started, and then and how he was forced out of the business, if you'd be willing to.
Sure, it's kind of complicated, and I don't want to bore anybody, but he started. There's a great article by Lloyd Jaquette, who was his original editor, who went on to do Famous Funnies, I think it is. And Lloyd Jaquette in the 50s wrote an article for a publisher's trade magazine, and he talked about how that all started, and it's quite wonderful. And so they started sometime in the fall of 1934. They set up shop, as Jaquette referred to it, and they started soliciting artwork, and also the Major went to a number of his pulp connections. So Joe Archibald, who was in the Major's original newspaper syndicate back in 1925-27, the Major had a newspaper syndicate, and he was publishing comics in newspapers back in 25, 26, 27. And Archibald, who was a very prolific pulp contributor, illustrations and stories, was part of that back in the 20s. And so Archibald is one of the first people in the Major's first magazine. And I'm still working on figuring out the actual technical aspects, because I really want to understand exactly how these things were put together. And I've been doing some research in color printing and during that period. So I'm still a little, I'm still kind of finding my way through that. But it's really fascinating to me, because the thing that's coming across to me is how expensive it was during the Depression, to do color printing. And so that's the reason why it was absolutely necessary to sell a hell of a lot of comics at 10 cents in order to, pay thousands of dollars to the printing for color printing. Originally, they were in black and white, the first 2 issues, but then they started to add color by the 3rd issue. So, and then there's the whole distributing aspect of it.
I was about to ask about that. How did that work? Because I know that, back in the old days when there were drugstores around still, even when I was growing up, comics were in the drugstores, although that was some 70 years after this. So I'm curious as to how they were able to do that, since your grandfather had been doing newspapers and magazines. Did he just use those same contacts to get them into the stores, or?
Apparently, they weren't so much in stores; they were on newsstands.
Okay.
And that's a whole other issue. There are issues of the mafia, Teamsters being involved in newspaper distribution. And it's a complicated story, and I don't know all the details. There are guys who have really gotten into this. David Saunders, whose father Norman was an illustrator of Pulp, and also he worked for Harry Donenfeld. And so David has done a lot of research into all the web of distributors and possible money laundering and that kind of thing. So I think that had a lot to do with why my grandfather lost his comics. I think that distributing aspect has a lot to do with it. And you wanted that in terms of how he lost the comics. I don't.
If you want to talk about it. If you don't, that's fine too.
Well, no, I think it's important for people to start to hear the story. He became partners with Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz, who ended up with DC Comics. And that he became partners with them in order to produce Detective Comics. And because he didn't have the funds to do it. So, and they did. How they had the funds in the Depression? Gee, I don't know. But they did. And so he went into business with them, and that was the beginning of the end. Basically, what they did, from what I can tell from all the legal documents, and there are a lot of them, is that, and he said this in the forced bankruptcy proceedings in 1938, he told the judge that he was being coerced. And essentially what I can tell from the documents is that in order for him to pay people, he would get the money from Donenfeld and Leibowitz, and in return for that, they had him sign more and more legal documents to take away his rights from him. So they basically pushed him into a corner, holding the money hostage. And finally, they forced him into bankruptcy. There are two types of bankruptcy. There's individual bankruptcy, where you say, I can't pay these things anymore, I'm going bankrupt. And there is forced bankruptcy, where 3 of your creditors force you into bankruptcy. And it's a lot more complicated than that, and not very nice. And he was just no match for them at that point. They had, huge firms of lawyers and accountants, and he had one young lawyer who probably ended up didn't get paid. So he was just no match for them. They got it.
And those two names are infamous on things of that nature too, and even dealing with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
Yeah, and that's what I think is important for people to realize. A lot of comics historians have been very negative towards my grandfather for a long time, as if he was part of that. But he wasn't part of that. He was also on the raw end of those deals, because the timing is exactly the same. When Leibowitz started trying to get Jerry Siegel to sign with them, that was in early December 1937. And they were already working behind the Major's back to oust him. And he was served bankruptcy papers on December 27, 1937. So that was all happening within the same time period.
I'm curious of something. So, I know that they had both died in the 1990s, Siegel and Schuster. I mean, did they ever talk about your grandfather? I mean, if you had found this stuff, you had mentioned, what year did you start doing the research?
7.
Did you talk to them at all?
No, but I have talked to a couple of people who have interviewed them at length.
Okay.
And I've also talked to Laura Siegel, Jerry's daughter, a lot. And I had a chance to talk to Jean Schuster Peavy, Joe Schuster's sister, a little bit before she was so ill. And great people, absolutely great. They have all been really kind and generous to me. And Jerry, at one point, he wrote, I think it was in 1987, when there was a 50th Batman anniversary. In the back of that is a letter. There are a number of letters there, and one of them is from Jerry, and in it, he says that they would have never made it into print without my grandfather. And I never got the impression that they had anything negative to say about him. And I haven't found anything negative that they wrote or said about him. Sheldon Mayer, on the other hand, has said a number of negative things about my grandfather to do with being paid. So, but, you know, not Siegel and Schuster. My grandfather really gave them their start.
And then, so how was he finding people when he started going out looking for creative people to work on these stories? And he had written some of them himself. But he had hired people like Siegel and Schuster. How did he find them? Did he put ads in the paper, or?
They found him. He had ads, I think, in maybe some of the trades, and Craig Fleisel said he saw an ad in the New York Times, but so far none of us have been able to find that ad. I think he must have seen it somewhere else, and, you know, age at that point just thought it was the New York Times, but none of us have been able to track that ad down. But there were ads originally in some of the trade papers, and you have to remember, this was the Depression. People were looking for work, and this was a very small community in a small area of New York City around Grand Central, Park Avenue South, which was called 4th Avenue at that point, and Madison Avenue, and, you know, from about 40, you know, in the mid 30s up to about 48th Street, that little area, there were art schools, there were artist studios, and publishers all in that area. So, you know, those guys saw each other at lunch, had drinks at the local bar, and the minute they find out that somebody's buying,
Right, they're all over it.
they're there. So I don't think they had any problem getting illustrators and artists.
I'm curious of something. So, you know, when I joined your Facebook page, there were, you know, how did you first hear about the Major? And I had heard about him through, there's Les Daniels had done a history of DC comic book, of DC Comics in 1997, I want to say, and he's mentioned in there. But he is also in Will Eisner's The Dreamer. And I'm curious, obviously that's a different version of him, but did Will Eisner know him, or did he just hear things? Do you know?
I don't really know, and that is a very, you know, Will Eisner drew that very unflattering drawing that is not accurate as to who he was as a person. I mean, just completely inaccurate. And Will Eisner would have been around, I think, 19 or 20 at the time that my grandfather was publishing. So you have to also think about that. So Sheldon Mayer was 19 when he first published comics with my grandfather. So you have to think about, here's my grandfather in his 40s, early 40s, and these guys are 19 and 20. So their views of him are going to be from that kind of mindset.
Sure.
And he was very different from a lot of the people that they knew. He was very cosmopolitan. He spoke a number of languages. He wore a camel hair coat that he had bought years ago that was of very good value, so he continued to wear it. And he wore a fedora, and that somehow got translated into he wore a cape and a beaver hat. And that's that's not true. He never wore a cape in his life. My grandmother would have killed him on the spot.
That was a different era too. And I think that the thing that we don't necessarily realize nowadays is that people were older quicker back then.
Yeah.
And so if you're in your 40s, you look like you're in your 60s or 70s now.
Right.
And I don't know why that is, but it is a fact that you take a look at somebody in their 60s even from the 1940s, and they look like they're going on 100. So if I had to make a judgment call on that, I would say that he probably looked way older than he actually was.
Oh yeah.
Being young.
Yeah, and he was from a very different background.
Sure.
He traveled the world. He was an experienced writer. My grandmother was, from a very aristocratic Swedish family. And he carried himself in a particular way because he was a military man. And so he was quite different from a lot of the people who were involved in pulp and comic publishing. He was very different. And, so I guess those kind of stories came up, and but they're not accurate. If you see pictures of him, I mean, he's just not that kind of person. He was very organized, very disciplined, and really cared about his comics. It broke his heart. It broke his heart to lose those comics. It took him a while to recover from that.
So did he hold on to any copies of that stuff?
Yes.
Okay.
And they're not there anymore.
Okay.
Because one of my half brothers at the age of 14 was playing with matches, and bye-bye. All that stuff went up in smoke. Really awful.
Well, it as long as your half brother had fun doing it.
Yeah, really.
All that, right? Well, I was curious because before we came on live, you had mentioned that you were going through, and actually, if you want to talk a little bit about this, but you were going through the different years and talk a little bit about what you've been doing with that.
Well, when we were talking earlier, I was mentioning how I was so disappointed last year because when New Fun was supposed to come out, the reprint that DC did was supposed to come out on January 11th, which was the original day that it came out 85 years ago, 86 years ago. And it January 7th was also my grandfather's 130th anniversary of his birth. So it was a really it seemed like such a great PR idea. And then COVID happened, and the whole diamond distributing, hoo-ha, and ATT, blowing up DC. I mean, it was just disastrous all year long. And of course, there was no PR on the new funds or on my grandfather. And I was really disappointed. And finally, I just picked myself up in November, and I just thought, okay, just face it. They're not going to do anything. It's November. Wake up. And I thought, okay, what can I do to put this out there? And so I decided that I would start with New Fund number 1 and go through all the comics from 1935. And that I would go through each one page by page and then write up my impressions of them. And so I started, and I really got into it in a big way. I just started to love those comics. And what I especially loved was seeing the evolution, because if you go comic by comic, you can see plain as day how things were changing, new creators who were coming in, new ideas were evolving. It's just really quite wonderful. If you love comics and you love comics history, doing something like that is it's very uplifting and very exciting. And I just, so I've posted all the way up to, I got through all the new funds. And then I got through the first, I think they call it the first annual, the big book of comics. I got through that. And then I just recently did a post on New Comics number 1, which eventually became Adventure. And now I'm working on More Fun number 7. And my intention is to continue through this year. And hopefully by March, I'll be in real time so that I'm posting about the comic as it came out 85 years ago.
So where are you finding these? Are they on like microfiche or?
Because of, the group that you're in, those guys are amazing. And a lot of those guys have privately given me digital copies of magazines that they have. Okay. And I also got some actual paper copies from the Billy Ireland Museum, and I haven't gotten to those yet. They're in the later period, and I'm very excited because it's going to be fun to actually look at a full-size paper comic, because sometimes I miss things with the digital copies, and sometimes they're not all that great, so I miss little details here and there, but it's just really fun. I'm having a great time doing it. So
it's interesting. I have this library app on my phone and on my iPad, and it's called Hoopla. And it's basically, you're able to read a lot of different things for free. You're able to borrow them from the library for like 3 weeks. And that's how I actually found out about New Fund number 1, because it appeared there. And one of the things DC Comics does, and it baffles me that they do this. As soon as something comes out as a trade paperback or a hardcover, they stick it right up on Hoopla so anyone can read it for free. And it's kind of like, well, do you guys not really want to sell this stuff? But I did see it there, and that's how I found out that it was out, because I didn't see it publicized anywhere. But that was a really weird time. I don't think that these companies knew then, and I think they still don't know to a certain degree exactly what they're doing, and where they're going.
I would totally agree with that.
And everyone's kind of walking around in the dark with their hands out, trying to be careful not to walk into any walls. But I think that, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking, I think that once you're able to go back to conventions, and once you're able to talk to people, that it's going to be a whole different story with that book. And it might be that the timing then is way better than it would have been, even last year when it came out.
Well, that would be absolutely wonderful, and I will keep that as encouragement. I'm also doing I'm writing a comic based on my grandfather's character, Sandra of the Secret Service. She's on the first page of New Fun #1. She's the first comic in that book. And that's important real estate to have her. And I think she's an amazing character. The reason I think my grandfather created her is because Charles Flanders and the other artist who drew her, Charles Flanders did not create characters, and he certainly wouldn't have created a female character as strong as Sandra. And she fits with the types of women that my grandfather created as characters, because he was brought up by a very strong woman. And also Jerry Bales noted that he wrote a number of the Sandra scripts. So I'm pretty sure that he created her. There really isn't anybody else that would have. So Lee Mars, who is a wonderful, talented artist, and I are recreating Sandra, and we're publishing it through David Lloyd's Aces digital publishing, Aces Weekly. So I'm very excited.
When is that? When is that scheduled to come out?
Sometime this spring.
And then, so what's out of curiosity, and we touched on this a little bit before, what's the story with the copyright on these characters that people don't know? Is it because they fell out of regular publishing, and so they're in the public domain, or how does that work?
Again, that's a gray area.
Okay.
And so I can do it.
Okay.
And that's I can do it.
Okay.
I don't know if we mentioned this. I don't think we did when you were speaking of characters. Is that Slam Bradley was created by my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people think that he was created by Siegel and Schuster, but he wasn't. He was created by my grandfather. And as was the comic that I think some people refer to as Radio Squad, which was Calling All Cars. And he also created Federal Men. So he would come up with these ideas and exactly how he wanted the character to look and what kinds of stories that he want, and then he would pass it on to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And I think he probably did that with a number of other things as well, that as I'm getting into the comics, I'm seeing some stories that are parallel to some of his Pulp stories and some of the characters that are similar. And I suspect that he might have done that more than once.
Well, that's kind of the head of any company.
Yeah.
That's what Stan Lee did with a lot of stuff too.
Yeah.
When he was working on Marvel things. So I think that I don't want to keep you too long. So I think we've been talking for about an hour. So I think I'd like to wrap up. Is there obviously New Fun is out now?
Yes.
And people would have to go and look for it. If you would like to, I can make sure that all the information on that is in the description that's down below right now. And what else would you like people to know on what you're working on?
I'm working on a full biography of my grandfather. DC Comics Before Superman has a short version of his biography, but I'm working on a full biography, which hopefully will be completed sometime this summer, and then it goes into the whole agent publishing deal, and we'll see what happens from there.
Well, there's I do have it. There's a book on Milton Caniff I bought a number of years ago, and it's like super duper thick, and I don't even know who it's published by, but it's out there. So biographies of comic creators are out there, so my guess is that it shouldn't be too tough. So where can people find you?
They can find me on Facebook, and the Major has a page on Facebook. And if people are really interested in the Major, I don't really, I don't need 3,000 people to be interested, but if people are really interested, I think our group on there is a lot of fun, and there are a lot of really great people in there. And then the Major has a website, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson.com, and the books are available. And if you buy from the website, you get my signature. And so, yeah, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter, although I don't really, find Twitter, Instagram, the whole 9 yards.
I'm on Twitter too, and I don't like it very much. A bunch of very angry people. And so I kind of stay off of it myself. Instagram is fun though. So, well, I think we're going to leave it there. And it's like I had mentioned earlier before we started, anyone who's interested in reading a copy of Visitations #1, which is my book, can email me at visitationscomicbook, all one word, at gmail.com, and I'd be happy to send you a digital copy. So thank you very, very, very much for watching this, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much. Oops. Hold on a second. I did that wrong.